Hello again, everyone. So following our last video, where we kind of talked about the high watermark of the civil rights movement, what we're going to be looking at now in this video is I'm going to begin retracing the steps of American involvement in the Vietnam War. This is going to be a two-part video. The first part is going to cover the period from basically from World War II all the way up till the end of the Eisenhower administration. The second video is going to cover the Kennedy administration and the first part of the Johnson administration, basically leading up to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So that's how we're going to do it. Now, start off a few things about the Vietnam War in and of itself. The Vietnam War is, I think, very important in understanding modern America. It's the most divisive war in American history and brings about one of the most divisive periods in American history since the American Civil War. And it's a war that largely taps into both generational and socioeconomic divides within American society and exploits them, or I should say, explodes those divisions in a very dramatic and far reaching way. The effects of the Vietnam War, the bitterness that it produces, the distrust in institutions and government that it creates are lingering effects that are in many ways still with us. And you could, in many ways, say that modern America, or many aspects of modern America at any rate, were created by the social disruption and the social unrest that the Vietnam era created. And so I think that's a very important thing. And that even, you know, gets back to in the previous video when we were talking about the civil rights movement at its, kind of its apex in 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. There's a reason why the civil rights movement begins to lose cohesion after 1965, and similarly a reason why support for many of Lyndon Johnson's social programs, many of his Great Society programs, begins to wane likewise after 1965. And in both instances, there are a variety of causes, but one of the central unifying causes that affects both in large measure is the war in Vietnam, which impacts the African American community disproportionately, as well as the working class white community in this country. Basically, poor and working class people of all colors and ethnicities are disproportionately affected by the war in Vietnam. And in terms of, creating what eventually comes to be known as the credibility gap in the Johnson administration that erodes support for not just his administration, but for government in general during the Vietnam War era. And this continues into the presidency of Johnson's successor, Lyndon Nixon, or Richard Nixon, sorry. So the good place to start would be, where does all this begin? And it begins pretty much during World War II. Actually, a little bit before that. Basically, in the late 19th century, around the time the United States is fighting the American Civil War with itself, the French colonize a area in Southeast Asia, including the modern-day states of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, that once they complete the conquest of it, they refer to as Indochina, and which comes to be known as French Indochina from that point onward. The French administered this area as one of their principal and most lucrative colonies from the late 19th century all the way up until the Nazi invasion in May of 1940 during the Second World War. French Indochina was a major source of raw materials for the French. Particularly, it was a vital source of rubber. There were a lot of rubber plantations in Indochina, in modern-day Vietnam in particular. So it was a very strategically important area, a very important colony in that regard. The thing is that after the French are themselves occupied by the Nazis after their blitzkrieg attacks of May of 1940 and their capitulation in June of that same year, uh, Indochina effectively ceases to be, in any meaningful sense, a real French possession. The French colonial officials there become aligned with the collaborationist government in metropolitan France and in Paris, known as Vichy, and very quickly they effectively surrender control of their colony and its economic resources to Germany's ally, Japan. The Japanese actually take over Indochina effectively in late 1940. And the French don't put up a fight with this. They just simply let them in and let them take over the colony. And so during World War II, the French colonial administration, the small French administrative um, population that lived in Indochina, they didn't really do anything to try to challenge Japanese occupation. Instead, resistance to the Japanese during World War II came from the indigenous population, who the French had effectively, you know, I won't say enslaved, but they had definitely, put them in a decidedly subordinate position within that society, going decidedly against the French ideals of l'égalité, égalité, fraternité, that go back to the French Revolution. Um, Apparently, those ideas only apply to white people. But anyway, so during World War II, the population of Indochina, specifically in modern day Vietnam, rises up against the Japanese late in the war in 1945. And they rally around this guy named Ho Chi Minh, who forms a guerrilla band that begins actually, waging a guerrilla war against the Japanese. Now, because of this, because of the fact that the force that Ho Chi Minh had organized, which he refers to as the Viet Minh, had begun taking the war to the Japanese, naturally, the United States, which is at the time at war with Japan, sees them as natural allies. And there begins to be significant correspondence between the United States and Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh forces. American doctors are parachuted in to treat Ho Chi Minh. American airmen that are shot down over French Indochina are taken in and given shelter by Ho Chi Minh's forces. And so basically, we're allies with these people during the latter phases of World War II, when the French are essentially sitting on their hands doing nothing while their territory is occupied by a foreign power. And so naturally, as far as many of the Vietnamese were concerned, this meant that when the war was over, that the United States should recognize their independence, let them form their own government, and tell the French, get out of here. Um, that doesn't happen, though, because, of course, by the time the war ends, the situation politically has changed substantially for the United States, and the United States now finds itself in an increasingly fraught ideological battle with the Soviet Union. Now, although Ho Chi Minh was a communist, he didn't really consider himself part of that. Not really. In fact, many of his fellow communists oftentimes accused him of being a nationalist first and a communist second. So he wasn't really that interested in, expanding communism or creating some sort of, global revolution or anything. He fundamentally wanted to to secure his country's unification and to get it to secure its independence from its former colonial rulers, the French. But that didn't happen because of the fact that Ho Chi Minh had publicly identified himself as a communist. And again, in the context of the Cold War, you have this very bipolar, very simplistic way of looking at things that sees anything, that even remotely resembles communism, much less people who actually call themselves communists, as being part of some global pathogen, some global contagion that has to be contained. And so, as a result of this, also out of fears that if the United States didn't um, give official sanction to the French efforts to restore their colonial governance in Indochina, that they might ally themselves with the Soviets or otherwise, leave the U.S. and other Western powers in a lurch in Western Europe. The U.S. tacitly allows for the French to begin reasserting colonial control over Indochina, even though they effectively had abdicated such control 6 years earlier. And so, as a result, in 1946, in spite of the United States' stated position in terms of it overseas European colonies that those European nations should grant recognition to independence movements and should let those people engage in self-determination. The United States instead backs a effort by the French government and the French military to reassert colonial control in Indochina. And so from that point onward, a guerrilla war develops in Indochina between the French and Ho Chi Minh's forces, the Viet Minh. And this is a very vicious and very brutal war. Ultimately, more than 200,000 Viet Minh and over 70,000 Frenchmen are killed in this conflict, which drags on for 8 years. And much as would become the experience of the United States in the 1960s, this war proves difficult for the French because it's hard to discern who in the local population is on whose side. And so atrocities on both sides are common. Mass executions, mass burials, mass pillaging, mass rape, all are common in the conflict on all sides. And it actually becomes a very unpopular war in France. The leftist press in France dubs it the Dirty War. And so the situation for the French does not improve. In spite of the fact that starting in 1950, the United States begins essentially bankrolling the French military effort there. Now, the U.S. isn't initially sending troops to Indochina to fight alongside the French, but they are providing them machine guns, tanks, airplanes, and everything else that they need to try to wage this war. By 1954, the United States is footing the bill for over 3/4 of the military expenditures that are going to fight this war. So the U.S. government is basically bankrolling this thing with little result. And so what ends up happening is that for all that money that the U.S. directs to the French military effort in Indochina, the French come up decidedly short in the military conflict. They end up suffering a terrible defeat in 1954 when a French garrison is surrounded by Ho Chi Minh's army in a valley called Dien Bien Phu. And so for 6 weeks, Ho Chi Minh's army lays siege to the French forces at Dien Bien Phu, who had foolishly allowed themselves to be put in an extremely vulnerable position with mountains all around them that basically gave the Viet Minh the high ground. They underestimated the skill and the competency of their opponents, and as a result, they ended up suffering catastrophic losses. The French government at one point actually begged President Dwight Eisenhower, who by this point has inherited the situation from his predecessor, Harry Truman. They beg Eisenhower to send in American troops or to potentially even use nuclear weapons against the Viet Minh to, to turn the tide in favor of the French. Eisenhower refuses, though he does send American transport planes to parachute relief supplies into the besieged French forces at Dien Bien Phu. it ends up not being enough, and as a result, the French garrison is forced to surrender to Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh forces. Now, this is, of course, a massive humiliation for the French, who have already suffered massive international humiliations because of the quick speed with which they were overrun by the Nazis during World War II, and further erodes their international military reputation. But it essentially proves that their position in Indochina is untenable. And so their defeat occurs right around the time that negotiations were supposed to start between the French and Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese Communist Party to try to bring this war to an end. As a result of their humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the French basically are forced to withdraw from Vietnam. They sign an agreement with Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh called the Geneva Accords. And what the Geneva Accords do is they do two things. The first thing that it does is it divides Vietnam into two countries, much like the Korean Peninsula had been divided between North and South Korea. The Geneva Accords likewise create a North and a South Vietnam. The North is, of course, controlled by Ho and the communists. The idea was that the South would have a government that was ostensibly democratic, which was supported by the West. This eventually takes the form of a government led by a man named Ngo Dinh Diem, who assumes control in 1954 as the first president of the Republic of Vietnam. And so there's this division that comes about as a result of the Geneva Accords. That's the first thing. The second part of the Geneva Accords, though, is that there was an agreement that within 2 years of that partition, that there would be elections held in South Vietnam to determine if South Vietnam would remain an independent state, ostensibly with the backing of the United States and Western powers, or whether it would join up and unify with the government in Hanoi in North Vietnam. Pretty much everybody knew that if that vote were allowed to take place, that North and South Vietnam would unify with one another, and that there would in fact be a communist government ruling all of Vietnam. Being that this is the height of the Cold War, this freaks out American political leaders. Dwight Eisenhower actually coins a phrase to reflect what many American strategic and political leaders fear is going to be the end result of this. He says that if you allow Vietnam to fall to communist aggression, if you allow South Vietnam, that is, to fall to communist aggression, then all these surrounding countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaya, Burma, Indonesia, would likewise fall to communist aggression like a stack of dominoes. And so from this is coined the term domino theory to describe this idea that if you allow South Vietnam to fall to communist forces, that all the rest of Southeast Asia and potentially other areas of the Asia-Pacific region that the U.S. had strategic influence in might likewise fall to communist aggression. And so it's because of this fear of that the domino theory represents that after the French exit in humiliating defeat in 1954, that the U.S. essentially assumes the role that the French had played before. Prior to 1954, the U.S. was bankrolling the French military effort in Indochina. But after the French exit in 1954, we essentially come in and take the place of the French. And we do this by trying to provide economic, political, and military aid to the Diem regime. And to that end, during the Eisenhower administration, President Eisenhower begins sending over not only large amounts of American economic and military aid and equipment to build up South Vietnam and its military, he also began sending in large numbers of American military advisors to train and equip the new military of South Vietnam, which comes to be known as the ARVN, or Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And so by the time he leaves office in January of 1961, there are about 900 American advisors in South Vietnam who are training ARVN forces, and who are seeing increasingly a situation in South Vietnam that, in spite of millions of American dollars being poured into the country for economic and military aid, is rapidly going south. Things are rapidly deteriorating in this country. And so ultimately, there's an insurgency that really picks up momentum in 1960. The Diem government was deeply unpopular with much of the population of South Vietnam for a number of reasons. Not only was Diem himself autocratic and corrupt, he famously manipulated the results of a 1955 referendum to give himself 96% of the popular vote, which was, of course, absolutely absurd, and basically barred political opponents from competing against him in South Vietnam, basically a dictator in many ways. But he also was a Catholic in a largely Buddhist country. And Diem very clearly favored the Catholic Church and the interests of urban Vietnamese over the interests of rural Vietnamese, who comprised roughly 80% of the country's population. So, due to a number of these factors, his autocratic nature, the corruption within his government, the religious tensions that his presidency created, and the fact that he had essentially forestalled any opportunity for a real, democratic political alternative to his government, you end up seeing a insurgency beginning to take shape in 1960, and it calls itself the National Liberation Front. And it begins to receive large amounts of supplies from North Vietnam, supplies that primarily come from either the Soviet Union or from communist China. And so this insurgency begins to intensify right towards the end of the Eisenhower presidency. And this insurgency, which comes to be known popularly as the Viet Cong, raises very serious questions for Dwight Eisenhower's successor, John F. Kennedy, who ultimately will look at the situation and make a series of momentous decisions that will dramatically escalate and up the ante of American involvement in the conflict, and ultimately pave the way for the massive expansion of America's combat role in Vietnam that will occur under Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, which is going to be this. And so that period of escalation during the Kennedy era and the early Johnson era is going to be the subject of our next video.